And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Yo, Lord willing, Jeff Canarsie, Mob Talk Radio. Check it out. Yo, we stay quiet like Russell Buffalino when things will get ugly like Pesci's death in Casino. Who do we know? No one, nobody. But we're all well respected like Delacroix and Gotti. I know wild nights, Havana nocturne. Light up a cigar and watch your spot burn. You'll get patty whacked, I'm tough like Irish dock workers. Run with guys, hooligans and block lurkers. Corner berserkers, street savvy soldiers. You owe, you better pay. Don't make me say I told you. Code you don't betray, I say what I mean. Providence and Brooklyn all the way to the bean. I'd rather be unseen, like Vinny the Chin. I don't gotta go to Vegas to see cities of sin. Pull the pin, drop bombs like Danny Green. I write homicide like the murder machine. Lansky Luciano, mastermind the racket. Up in the clam house with a million in my jacket. Move around when the streets get darker. Pay homage to real bosses like Gambino and Patriarcha. Mob talking, but you don't talk to the mob. Lord Will and Jeff Canarsie, we stay on our job. This is Mob Talk, straight from the streets. Mob Talk, the life over beats. Lord Will and Jeff Canarsie, bringing you the real. Kill all rats, you already know the deal. This is Mob Talk, straight from the streets. Mob Talk, the life over beats. Lord Will and Jeff Canarsie, bringing you the real. Kill all rats, you already know the deal.
And welcome to Mob Talk Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Canarsie. Today we got a big show. We're going to cover some Q&A, Santo Trafficante Jr., and a little bit of Senior, which is kind of going to be all over the place a little bit, so just bear with me on that. We're going to cover some news and notes and everything else. Hope everybody had a good week. I think the first thing I really want to start with, which I wasn't going to start with, but I am, is I wanted to talk about Gene Gotti getting out of prison. First of all, if you don't know who Gene Gotti is, which I would find it tremendously hard to believe at this point, but he just was released from prison probably almost about a week ago. Did 29 years in prison for many different things, but I don't want to necessarily talk about what he did. That's sort of not the point. The point is that there have been a lot of media outlets, Radar Online, which, I mean, Radar Online is like the National Enquirer, and the New York Post and some other social media, and it is on social media too, like all over the place. I think the headline was Gene Gotti is getting out of prison and the mob is shaken, or the mob is concerned. Why? He's been gone 29 years. He hasn't been on the street in 29 years. He probably doesn't know how to operate a fucking iPhone. The internet wasn't what it is now. Cars are different. Everything is different. So I don't understand for the life of me why this is such a big, hot news topic. First of all, let's get the truth. The truth is that every news outlet in New York can't really sell a paper without mentioning Gotti. It's just the way it's been for 3 decades now, and I don't expect that to change. But the bigger issue is that why can't they just leave people to fuck alone? This guy has not been on the streets in 30 years. He's not involved in anything. But the paper would have you believe that that's not the case. And not only is it a scumbag fucking thing to do, but they're sitting outside of the guy's fucking house taking pictures of him and writing these salacious stories. And at some point, as a journalist, the New York Post has become like the fucking paparazzi at this point. They're hiding out a block away, taking photos as he comes outside of his house. Leave the guy the fuck alone. You know, he did his time. In an era where mob guys, former mob guys, whatever the case may be, can't do time and they rat on everybody, this is a guy that didn't. He could have taken a plea deal and only done, 7.5 in the can. But he didn't. He didn't say a word. He took his medicine like a man, did his time like a man. Leave him the fuck alone. It's just got to stop at some point. This vulture type of atmosphere has to stop. George Anesthesia does the same shit in Philadelphia to other people, so that's nothing new. But it's just like, come on, the guy did 30 years. Leave him alone. Let him just live out the rest of his life in peace. But see, the media doesn't want to let anybody with that last name rest. That's just the way it is. And listen, I know a lot of people are going to say he is a mouthpiece for the Gottis. He's going to say whatever they instruct him to say. First of all, that's A, not true. B, anything that I decide to talk about on my show that's even remotely Gotti related is because I decide to. My phone doesn't ring. Angel's not like, hey, Jeff, I need you to do this, or can you say that? She doesn't ask me to do anything. None of them do. None of them ever have. None of them ever will. Everything that I do on my own behalf. There has recently been sort of an inundated message bullshit and comments on my Facebook page about me being a mouthpiece for the Gottis, or I should stop riding the Gotti dick. The truth is that I have long defended anybody who has been taken advantage of, anybody that's had shit said about them that isn't accurate. I fight for the underdogs in every facet of my life. That's the way I've always been. So for those people that say that I'm riding so-and-so's dick, it's a little stupid to me. And the reason why it's stupid is because you have to ask yourself a very important question. Why would I do that? Is somebody paying me? No. If somebody was, that would make sense then, wouldn't it? But nobody is. Nobody ever has. Nobody ever will. So what possibly can you idiots who are leaving these messages and posting on YouTube and Facebook and all this other garbage you're doing on Instagram, what is one good reason why I would intentionally put a target on my head from the FBI, law enforcement, and every other nickel and dime shitheel that has an opinion? Why would I intentionally put myself with a target? Think about it. I wouldn't. It doesn't make sense. The only reason why I do what I do is because I defend people that I like and people that I care about, people that have treated me well. And so the rats that are out there spewing their nonsense and their garbage, they can continue to fucking do that. I defend guys in Philadelphia, for Christ's sake. So this isn't just a Gotti fucking narrative. This is a narrative about fighting for people that are getting fucking picked on and bullied by the fucking press, by your like goons and your vultures like George Anesthesia and Dave Ratweiser and those types of swamp creatures. I've always defended other people. It has nothing to do with anything other than people are good to me, I'm good to them. How you treat me is how you get treated. So for everybody that is like saying this nonsense, A, it's not true, and B, I would love for you to come up with a solid fucking reason as to why I would do that and put a target on my head. Why would I do that? If you think for one fucking minute, and this is the God's honest truth, if you think for 1 minute that I'm mentioning them because it does something for me, it does nothing for me. I don't need to use that name to propel my show. I don't need to use that name to get clicks. I don't need to use that name to make a name for myself. Other people do that. That's not my game. Secondly, and then I'm going to shut up about it, is that I put myself on an FBI radar by talking about the Gottis. I put myself in a shitty spot. Not because they're bad people, but because the FBI has a fucking an itchy asshole about the Gottis. They always have. They always will. It never ends. And so anybody that aligns themselves with them, anybody that people want to make assumptions about me and my friendship with whoever, it's just ridiculous. So rationally, for you idiots that are making these comments, just rationally, you don't have to like me, but just ask yourself a rational question. What am I getting out of this? What are the positives I get? Sure, there's lots of positives, but what ultimately am I attaining by doing this? I'm getting nothing but grief. So if I couldn't take it or I couldn't stand it or deal with it, why would I keep doing it? And I keep doing it because I fight for the underdogs. I will always do that. Same way in Philadelphia, like I said earlier. So it all kind of comes to a close with leave Gene Gotti alone. Let him just live his fucking life. These people just want to make a mountain out of a fucking molehill. I can't wait for George Anesthesia to come along this week and go, Gene Gotti is a hitman now for the Gambino crime family. Because that's the type of shit he's going to say. He's going to try to weave and bob and insert his stupid fucking uninformed opinion like he always does. And that's just the reality of it. So all that being said, I just wish that the reporters and everybody would just leave the fucking shit alone. Leave the guy the fuck alone. There's not one fucking solid piece of information that any of these jerk-offs with a voice can give me that makes that story relevant in 2018. 1980, absolutely. 2018, not so much. All right, so here's some Lucchese news. Stephen Crea wants the judge tossed in his case. We're going to talk. I'm not going to go into details about the 19 guys that were arrested in this indictment, but more or less, Stephen Crea is alleging that the judge overseeing the case, whose last name is Siebel, who's overseeing the case, cannot be an impartial judge. The reason, years ago, Siebel, who was a prosecutor, and this goes back to Siebel's early days as a prosecutor before she became a judge, investigated him in another case. Stephen Crea is being charged with other crimes, including the murder of Michael Meldish, who was the leader of the Purple Gang. Crea is allegedly the boss of the Lucchese crime family. From the 1991 case, it showed via the government exhibits that Crea was identified allegedly as the acting consigliere of the Lucchese crime family, and this comes from Siebel's disclosure to the defense that she was involved in investigating Anthony Barada, who was pinned as the acting underboss at the time. And she actually investigated Barada from 89 to 91. While the judge admitted that she likely did investigate them, and in the probe back in those days, that she really couldn't remember anything. She argued in court that the allegations that Crea was She argued that the allegations that Crea was a Lucchese member for decades wasn't enough to recuse herself. I totally disagree. I think if she oversaw a case or she oversaw an investigation into Stephen Crea years ago, or anybody he was associated with, that she is impartial. Because she's familiar with the case. She went on record as saying that Stephen Crea was a Lucchese crime family member for decades, and everybody knew who he was. So if that's the case, you're already sort of fucking skewed in the matter. And I know that Stephen Crea's attorneys are definitely going to fight this one. Whether or not the legitimacy of this sort of comes to fruition is one thing. But I think that if she was on a team that was investigating these guys 20 years ago, I think it's sort of incumbent that she's not on the case now because she's already dealt with them. How she cannot fucking remember that is a little bit mysterious to me, but that's the case. Okay, Vincent Bruno, Lucchese crime family member, allegedly pled guilty to attempted murder. He officially pled guilty to murder in the aid of a racketeering conspiracy. Bruno, 34, was one of 19 alleged mobsters arrested in 2017 in the Lucchese crime family investigation. Matty Madonna, alleged underboss, Stephen Crea Sr., alleged boss, were also arrested in that sweep. Bruno was part of a murder plot, according to the prosecution, that the plot essentially targeted a member of the Bonanno crime family. The prosecution alleges that there was a beef between the Luccheses and the Bonannos at a Bronx social club that led to the 2012 murder plot. According to the prosecution, Stephen Crea ordered his son, Stephen Crea Jr., to kill a mafia associate he didn't like that he felt had offended him. The son allegedly passed the hit on to Paulie Roast Beef Casano, but Casano could never locate the subject, and eventually the beef would end up being settled. But since the drop of this indictment, 10 of the 19 defendants have already pled out. So it's going to be interesting to see sort of what comes out of this. I don't think it just looking at the basics of it, it doesn't look good, but I think that these guys are definitely going to fight. But when 10 of the 19 plead out, I mean, this is just a symptom of what we see today. Guys just can't fight charges, especially when the government has a blank checkbook, so to speak. Okay, all that being said, I kind of wanted to talk about something else before we take a break and come back and get into your questions. It's not very often that I really think about my show in terms of people enjoying it. I mean, I'm glad everybody does, and I know people like it, but sometimes I don't really realize, and maybe this is me being naive or just not giving myself enough credit, but I don't really take into consideration that my show, despite the genre of what I'm talking about and some of the opinions that I have, I didn't realize sort of how my show impacts people. Sure, it impacts people for definitely all the negative reasons sometimes, but I think that I just haven't really. I'm trying to look for the right phrase or words here, but sometimes I don't think about the impact that my show has in the positive. A lot of people seem to like my show, and it helps people in a weird kind of freaky way, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I think sometimes that I just don't take into consideration that people really like it, and it's sort of a bonding thing. With all that being said, sort of some sad news. I didn't know this individual, but it's relevant to what I just said. Mob Talk Radio lost, a fan in the last few days. He was a friend to the show. Casey McCracken is a friend of mine, obviously, but his father, Mike Kraken, passed away. While, I didn't know Mike, I really do value everybody who listens to my show. Even the people that say nasty, negative shit that I don't fucking like. I value everybody that listens to the show, because without you, there really isn't a show. And I take seriously 99% of the stuff that is said on my page to me. I try to get back to everybody as soon as I can. It's just when you get 500 messages a day, it's really, really hard to just answer everybody. So that's why if I do answer, usually my answers are very short. Anyway, so Casey sent me the following message, and I was very, 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 very blown away by this. He says, Jeff, my father passed away last night. My father was a huge fan, and we would listen to the show. We would listen to every show together. He had Parkinson's and was unable to watch TV, and we had to find a good podcast and audio show for him to be able to enjoy. He really, really loved your show. And that's not the only thing that was sent to me. Casey also reached out to me. I think it was about 2 a.m, and I'd expect he's probably not sleeping. I know I wasn't when my father passed away. So I'm going to read his message. He gave me permission to do it. And then we'll sort of try to wrap this up in a very sincere manner. Hey, Jeff, I just wanted to quickly tell you an awesome story about my dad and how it relates to Mob Talk Radio. No need to share, but of course you're more than welcome to. So my dad and I had a law office right when I graduated law school. It was flipping great. Us two working together, making money and having fun. Anyway, as it relates to Mob Talk Radio, we had a small 2-office building, and I would get there at 7 a.m. sharp and put on the Jim Rome show from the day before, right when I came in. After Jim Rome came Mob Talk Radio. Back then it was a mix of a podcast, shows. I'd just pick one and go with it. Literally would recycle them one day after the other. Anyway, one day we had a client coming in early, but we were also listening to one of the really animated Mob Talk Radio shows. You were absolutely killing it. So the client shows up in the middle of one of your great monologues where you so appropriately use the awesome word fuck, and my dad has our office radio on high, like literally fucking blasting it. So I tell my dad, hey, easy, so-and-so. The client is here. And you know what he says? You know what he fucking says? He says, if Alonzo, who was the client, can't appreciate a man, speaking of myself, who knows how to correctly and appropriately use the word fuck, well then fuck him. He truly loved your show. That's a great story. I get the word, my usage of the word fuck, for instance, okay? My father always told me that it's not the words that you use, it's how you use them. And I learned from the best. My father could weave the word fuck like you have no idea. He could stand at a funeral and give a fucking eulogy and use fuck every other word. And it was funny just the way he did it. My father was as tough as they come in a sense. And listen, and I'm not trying to dive onto a path here, but I think that listening to Casey talk about his father and the love he had for his father and the fact that his father loved my show, it sort of reminded me of my own father who passed away in 2004. And he, what a guy he was. He just took care of everybody. He had a temper like you wouldn't believe. If you met my father, military guy, but wasn't like the military guy that was all USA. He wasn't like that at all. But he was very proud of his country, proud of his service, et cetera, et cetera. But my father took care of everybody in the neighborhood. It's the way he was. I don't know if that's an old school trait. or where he really got that from. I think he just enjoyed helping other people. But I can remember, like, for instance, like when we was kids and he would take us places, I had a lot of friends that their fathers weren't around. Some of them didn't have either one of their parents around, and they just kind of ran the streets. They never had money or nothing. And my father, would load all us kids up. We'd all meet somewhere, and he would say, okay, what do you want to go do, son? And maybe it was a movie, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. And there was always one or two kids that were standing there that, they knew they couldn't afford to go. They didn't have any money, and they just sort of stood there shuffling their feet looking down, and my father wouldn't embarrass them. He wouldn't say to them, oh, you don't got no money? Well, my father wasn't that type of guy. He would just look at them and say, what are you doing? And they would say, well, there is no, get in the fucking car, let's go. And my father would reach into his pocket. My father had 500 kids. And when I say that, of course, I'm being figurative. It's not to be taken literally. My father didn't have 500 children. But he might as well have. Because the amount of kids that he took care of from my neighborhood, from other neighborhoods, anybody that needed anything, my father reached right into his pocket. He wouldn't hesitate. My mother was the same way. You hungry? You need to eat. Come in. She would feed an army, my mother. That's just the way my father was. I don't think that when I say 500 children, all of my friends call my dad Dad. That's just the way it was. He treated everybody like they were his own. If you visited my father's house and you walk in, he either loved you or he fucking hated you. There was no in between. He wouldn't tolerate certain things, but, he treated everybody like they were his own kids. That's just the way my father was. But don't get it twisted. My father had a fucking rage about him that I still don't understand. He could be nice, quiet, discerning, caring guy, very affectionate guy. But boy, if you pissed him off, it was like unearthing Satan. I'm not kidding. His eyes would go from green to fucking red, and it was on. And the one thing you didn't do with my father is fuck with his kids. If you fucked with his kids, he would get to a place where serial killers go. I watched him one time choke the shit out of a hockey coach because he cut me. My father went fucking crazy and grabbed him by his throat and lifted him off his feet. And my father wasn't a big guy. He just had a tolerance for certain stuff. So all that being said, we wanted to wish the McCracken family, obviously, there's not words that I could put to it that would make it fucking more acceptable. It is sort of what it is. I've never been good at words when it comes to somebody passing away. But like I told you before, Casey, that after a while the tears subside, that the laughter comes, and the laughter comes in droves, and things that you probably aren't thinking about now are going to come to you, and they're going to be hilarious. They're going to be even more hilarious than they ever were. That's how it worked for me. There are things about my father that I remember every once in a while that they tickle me. They tickle the fucking shit out of me because he was a funny guy. And, for anybody who hasn't lost a parent, it's not an easy thing. It sort of has a way of changing you in ways that you never sort of laugh the same again. You never sort of enjoy life exactly the same again. But then there are good things that do come out of it. And I'm not going to get into that because then this isn't a mob show. Then I become like fucking Dr. Drew or one of these fucking nut jobs that tells you how to get over death and destruction. And I have no right telling anybody how to get over that. I can only tell you what works for me. So we send our best to the McCracken family, and I wish I had known sooner that your father loved my show. I could have done more, I guess. But I just wanted to take a couple minutes and recognize that a fan of the show has passed away, and the only way that I know how to pay tribute to somebody like that sort of goes back to my father, because my father, before he passed away, wanted one thing and one thing only, and he wanted bagpipes at his funeral. Why? I have no idea. He's Scottish-Irish, or Scotch-Irish, or Irish-Scottish, whatever you want to call it. He wanted bagpipes. That's what he wanted. There were other things that he wanted that just weren't feasible, but we gave him the pipes because the pipes are what he wanted. So with that being said, we're going to take a break on Mob Talk Radio. When we come back, we're going to get into your Q&A, and followed by Santo Trafficante Jr. Hey, welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to cover your questions and get on to Santo Trafficante Jr. I got a lot of questions here. It's going to be a little all over the place because I'm still trying to catch up to some other ones. But I think the first question is, why do I keep hearing that Joey Merlino isn't even a made guy? I don't know why you're hearing that, because that's not true. I wasn't there, obviously. But I don't think that you would see New York allow somebody to be allegedly the boss of a crime family if they weren't a made guy. I think a lot of people are going to spin a narrative. People are going to say a lot of things about Joey Merlino that aren't true. They've been doing that since the 90s. I don't think anything like in terms of Joey are going to change. I think Philadelphia doesn't get the respect it deserves, I'll tell you that much. And I think that Philadelphia in general, first of all, Philly's got a vibe. South Philly has always had a vibe. I lived in South Philly, so for those who didn't know, I lived in South Philly for a while. First of all, I love the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, got to give it to the Eagles. But I think that South Philadelphians just have a soul that is different. New Yorkers would call them rude. Or whatever the fuck, but I dig South Philadelphia. I always have. I always got along with people from South Philly. We were like-minded in a lot of ways, and we love the Eagles. So all that being said, I don't know where the bullshit with Joey comes from. I think people are going to say things because people don't like Joey. Why they don't like Joey is probably for a million different things. But for those that don't know Joey is a good guy. He's not like I tell people sometimes, and it's like they don't believe me, but Joey's a good guy. He's not what you think he is. He's a very personable, likes to talk sports and that kind of stuff. So I mean, the idea that he's like some fucking vampire or Dracula that comes out of his cave at night just is it's a little ridiculous to me. But all that being said, listen, whether or not he's a made guy, I think you just have to use common sense when it comes to that. Not that you don't have common sense for asking that. I just think that sometimes you can answer your own question by just sort of thinking about it in terms of the realities. All right, question number 2. Why wasn't Al Capone invited to the Atlantic City meeting, given the power he held in Chicago? Al Capone was actually, believe it or not, in attendance at that meeting. And there's an important reason why he was, and there's something that resulted in that. And the first thing is what was the Atlantic City meeting? This was before the Havana Conference, and this in many ways may have been more important than the Havana Conference. Keep in mind they're coming right off of Prohibition. And the conference was held from May 13th to the 16th in 1929, and the topic was how to stop the violence from bootlegging wars that were taking place in New York and Chicago at the time, and they wanted to figure out how to avoid them. They also discussed the legitimate enterprises and how to funnel money from Prohibition into legitimate liquor enterprises and how to remain profitable with the end of Prohibition. The attendees, and I'm not going to read every name, but I'm going to throw some names at you, and this will show you, to the extent of the people that were there. Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Nucky Johnson, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Frank Scalish, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Lucchese, Willie Moretti, Bugsy Siegel, Jacob Shapiro, Longies Willman, Dutch Schultz, Oni Madden, Frank Erickson, Frank Nitti, Joe Guzik, Frank Rio, Frank McLean, Irving Wexler, Harry Stromberg, Mo Dalitz, Abe Bernstein, Charlie Solomon, Joe Lazia, Santo Trafficante Sr., and Sam Carolla. Now, those are just that's the majority of the names, but think about all of these guys were fucking huge. These aren't like your associates. These are all the heavy hitters. Maranzano and Massaria were not invited to this, and there was a reason why. Also, Joe Bonanno was not invited to this because somebody will come at me and say, well, why wasn't Joe Bonanno there? He wasn't because they didn't trust Joe Bonanno. None of them did. They never really did. And Joe Bonanno was way too close to Salvatore Maranzano for his own good. What they also did at this meeting was they sort of divided up territory. They talked about gambling, and they laid out the groundwork for the National Racing Wire, which ultimately we know today when you go to the track, there's the racing wire. If it's out of Santa Anita, you can get on the TV screen the odds and all of that stuff. So the mob really was at the forefront of bringing that along. But there was also another issue there. The problem in Chicago with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is that Al Capone put the whole entire fucking mafia on the map at that point with some of the shit that he pulled. Lucky Luciano wasn't happy about it. A lot of the other guys weren't happy about it. And what they essentially told him was that, Al, you got to do something here. This is too high profile. This is going to create havoc. At the time, also, Capone was sought after for questioning of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And at the same time, he was wanted for some other minor charges. And he was basically refusing to allow police to arrest him in Chicago, because he was going to end up getting sent to prison, and it was over a minor charge, but he was refusing to do it. And the mob essentially looks at Al and says, no, that's what you're going to do, because this is the only way the St. Valentine's Day Massacre heat is going to end. And shortly after that meeting, Al Capone goes to Philadelphia, leaves Jersey, goes to Philly, walks right up to a cop, announces who he is, and he gets arrested, and he would end up going to prison. They also discussed the issues at this meeting about Maranzano and Joe Masseria, and they all agreed at some point that Masseria and Maranzano had to go. In Chicago, Detroit, Boston, and Philadelphia, the representation there agreed that they would kill the old guard in their respective cities if they absolutely needed to be able to move on. So that was a huge meeting. There was a lot of implications to the meeting. And that sort of laid a lot of the groundwork that would be, obviously known as the Five Families. It was the groundwork for territory, the groundwork for a lot of different things. Okay, Jimmy Burke, Greg Scarpa, Tommy Karate, who was the most feared, and would any of them have the stones to take on one another? Okay, of the three, Jimmy Burke, Greg Scarpa, Tommy Karate. All right, jeez, you guys with these fucking questions. First of all three of these guys are fucking maniacs. Tommy Karate was absolutely a fucking loose cannon in every imaginable way. Greg Scarpa, sort of the same deal, but Greg was more calculated. Jimmy Burke, it was always business. I think all three of them enjoyed murder tremendously, but I don't think Jimmy Burke would go out of his way to look at it to commit murder. So let's push Jimmy Burke to the left for a minute. All right, between Greg Scarpa and Tommy Karate, the most feared of the bunch, that's a tough one. I really don't even know if I could give you a reasonable answer for that, because each one in their own right was probably more feared by the other. And they're all pretty relative to the same time period, but if I really, honest to God, had to pick one that I think was more feared out of anybody, probably Greg Scarpa, just because he did not fuck around for a second. Tommy Karate, same sort of deal, but I just think Greg had a different thing about him. Tommy Karate killed a lot of different people for reckless reasons, which might make him more feared than Scarpa, but I think in terms of, if I think gangster, I think Greg Scarpa probably would have been the most feared of the three. I think he probably held a lot more weight than Tommy Karate, but I could be wrong. Let me know what your opinion is. All right. If there was more than one shooter in the John F. Kennedy assassination, did the FBI have any other suspects high on their list? And what happened to any of the additional rifles used? Okay, this is kind of opening up sort of a conspiracy theory type of thing. I don't want to get onto a huge fucking rabbit trail on this, but what I will say is this. I definitely think that there was more than one shooter, so let's push that to the left. Did the FBI have anybody that they thought had something to do with it that was high on their list? Absolutely. Frank Sheeran was at the top of that list. So was Johnny Roselli. So was Russell Buffalino. So, I mean, the list was humongous. But if we're going to talk about realistic suspects, Johnny Roselli was really at the top of that list. As far as what happened to the other rifles used, who knows? I wasn't there. I wasn't at Dealey Plaza. I don't know what happened. But I would speculate that, I believe John. First of all, if you get shot from the fucking front, you don't go forward when you get shot, right? If you look at the Zapruder film, as Kennedy is riding along, blah, 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 you literally see him lurch backwards first, then he lurches forward. If you're getting shot from behind, so to speak, you don't lurch back. You would lurch forward. That's just the way that this stuff works. So if you look at the film closely, I think he was shot from the front first from the front, then he got shot from behind. The shot that opened up the front of the front of his fucking head came from the front, not from the rear. Because normally, if you look at bullet trajectories and etc., when the bullet hits, there's an impact and it blows out. But the way the shot was, and this could be subject to my interpretation and everybody else's, is you just got to watch the film closely, and a lot of stuff doesn't add up. And I don't want to get into like the gross shit about that because that was kind of gross. But I think for the sake of this question, I think Johnny Roselli would have been at the top of the FBI list. Absolutely. But it's kind of funny because, if you follow the conspiracy, they were in on it. So, all right. Was Roy DeMeo really involved in the sale of child pornography and bestiality films? Well, here's my thing. If you listen to what Jerry Capisci says in Murder Machine, yes, he was. And one of the problems is that Castellano was going to get indicted for that shit too. However, do I really, this becomes a moral argument that I really think is vile and disgusting, and I don't want to get into it. But the thing is that DeMeo didn't produce the films. DeMeo basically got his hands on them and distributed them to other people for a price, and they put them out. Is there a moral compunction that's wrong about snuff films? Sure, absolutely. But once again, this is coming from who? Jerry Capisci and the FBI. I find it very, very hard to believe, knowing who Roy DeMeo was, that he would sell any sort of videotape with a child being fucked by an adult. I just don't buy it. I've never bought it. I think that what that simply was information provided by Richard Kuklinski, who had very limited dealings with Roy DeMeo, because it was actually Roy DeMeo who shook Kuklinski down for some of the other porn stuff. That was Richard Kuklinski's only involvement with the mob. He's a serial killer. He's not a mob guy. Why people keep saying that is beyond my understanding. But I think that this was a tactic that was probably likely used by the FBI to try to punk Roy DeMeo and Castellano. Think about it for a second. The amount of ego and pride in what these men stood for, and yet you're going to label them as a child porn producer. I mean, I have a hard time buying it. I also have a hard time buying anything that Jerry Capisci says on the matter, because he's taken it directly from the FBI's point of view, which is, show me proof. Show me a 302. Show me paperwork, or show me a video with Roy DeMeo watching child porn and selling child porn. I just don't think it's reality. I don't think he did it. Would there have been maybe some porn tapes that were sort of on the boundaries of that? Maybe so. But to say that Roy DeMeo was involved in it, it's a stretch for me. I just have a hard time buying it. And I'm going to tell you something. Honest to God's truth. If that were the case and Paul Castellano was going to get indicted for child sex trafficking like these fucking morons keep putting all over Twitter and everywhere else, don't you think that Castellano would have A, killed fucking everybody involved immediately? B, don't you think Castellano would have been killed immediately? Because that's like some egregious shit. So I find it hard to believe. If somebody can provide me evidence of it, then absolutely I would change my mind. But until that, I just don't buy it. All right, your videos on White Boy Rick. Piece of shit, rat motherfucker. Got what he deserved. That's the end of it. All these people cry. Listen, and I'm not pretending to know a lot about the situation or a lot about White Boy Rick. Obviously, I know a little bit because a lot of people have been talking about it with the upcoming movie. But let's stop glorifying him for what he is, and he's a fucking rat. A lot of people are complaining, oh, he's still sitting in prison. He's a fucking rat. He didn't get a good deal. He's still in prison, so at least, I don't know, maybe the FBI on that. First of all, I don't believe the FBI has morality at all, but it seems like in this particular case, they didn't cut him a deal. And that's fantastic, because you shouldn't get rewarded for telling on people. How many people died as a result of this little prick opening his fucking mouth? Plenty. So if you find the narrative or the story interesting because he was a white guy from Detroit, who was able to sell drugs at a young age, and he was the youngest guy ever to be put on the FBI payroll at 14. That's an interesting story. I'm interested in the story of how he sort of got to where he got, but the minute he starts talking, I'm done. I'm just absolutely fucking done with the guy. I'm sure he has his relevance in certain circles, but at the end of the day, he's a fucking rat. And I cannot budge from that. All right. How powerful was Joe Profaci compared to all the other bosses pre-Gotti area? Joe Profaci was strong, but here's the thing about Joe Profaci. Bonanno, at some point, absorbed the majority of the Profaci crime family. Profaci treated his own men like shit. Profaci was not liked by the people that were involved with him. Profaci was an egotist. Profaci was a greedy prick, and just wasn't respected by a lot of the other people. So how much power did he have? I don't think he had any type of power compared to the other bosses at the time. Did he have power? Of course he did, but nobody took the guy that seriously. There were just too many complaints, too many problems. And Joe Bonanno really, at the end of the day, was the one that was kind of nudging Profaci to get the fuck out of the mob, because Bonanno realized he could take over Profaci's rackets, and that's what Bonanno wanted. And it also helped with the marriage between Rosalie Profaci and his son Bill Bonanno. So pre-Gotti, how powerful? Listen, Carlo Gambino could shut down the whole fucking Eastern Seaboard. Profaci would be lucky if he could open up a can of fucking tuna. That's just the way I see it. There's going to be people that are going to argue with me about that, I'm sure, but that's just the reality. All right. Are you going to do a show on Joe? Sorry about that. You might hear a glitch. My thing stopped recording for a second. Are you going to do a show on Joey the Clown Lombardo? How exactly are your documentaries going to be different from the others that are out there? Okay, the first thing is, yeah, I'm going to do a show on Joey the Clown Lombardo at some point, but not right this second. I've got a lot of names in the hat. When we move towards doing the webpage, which I'm going to back off until January at this point about as far as opening that up, I'm going to do, there's going to be, how to explain this? There's going to be a more in-depth sort of podcasting that I do where I talk about, where I'll do like 3 weeks of Chicago stuff, 3 weeks in New York, 3 weeks of this, 3 weeks of that. And so some of these other guys who I'm still doing research on, I am going to cover, but it's just sort of, because I'm doing it once a week at this point, I kind of sort of take not the easiest subject, but the one where I can grab the most information from the quickest, because some of these other guys, the family secrets trial and that kind of stuff, I really want to look at court documents and stuff like that. All right, so also asked was, how are your documentaries going to be different than others out there? Because I know people. That's the first thing. And when I say I know people, what I mean by that is I know people that are willing to talk. I know people that are willing to give an opinion that new people. I know I have copies and copies and copies of court documents. A lot of these mafia documentaries, some of them are very good, but some of them are just very shady, and they're very like guy with sunglasses sitting in the corner, blah blah blah. Or there are these cheesy fucking reenactments which are just absolutely like pitiful. I'm not going to do anything like that. Mine's going to be more mainstream than that. There will obviously be some reenactment type of stuff, but I've always wanted to cover this topic not from a law enforcement point. It's got to be from the street narrative, the street perspective. And when you talk to people that hung around with people like Joey Gallo and some of these other guys that are still alive and that are willing to talk, that's an incredible story because they had firsthand knowledge. They were there. They were friends. We all know Crazy Joe Gallo is Crazy Joe Gallo. But people that sat with him and had dinner and they had conversations on music and other things, to me, that's what is riveting. Yeah, we want the blood, the guts, the glory, and all of that, but it's the personal stories that other people can't get. They don't invest the time in trying to get. And so my documentaries are going to be very driven from the gangster perspective, not the fucking cop perspective. Okay. Some of the most famous mob hits, it's been common knowledge who the shooters were, such as Albert Anastasia, Carmine Galante, Angelo Bruno. We know who the shooters were. Why is this not the case with Castellano? Did they do that great of a job concealing themselves, or does everyone in the underworld know who they were? First of all, I know who 4 of them were. So if I know who 4 of them were, I don't know why anybody else can't find that out. The information's out there. You just kind of got to find it. Now, are you going to find out everybody? No. One of the more complex things about the Castellano hit was everybody dresses alike. Everybody dresses the same. Shoot a motherfucker in fucking Midtown Manhattan during the holiday season in rush hour. Perfectly executed to the extent that when everyone looks alike, guess what? You have one description. There's, 6, 7, 8, 9 shooters or whatever the fuck it is. They all look alike. You can't give an accurate description of one guy. It's very brilliant that the way that the hit was designed itself. But as far as, people not knowing about it, that's bullshit. Everybody knows. Listen, in the underworld, things get passed like everything else. There isn't, some secret lair where they all go to discuss crime and stuff like that. It's much like to use being on a baseball team. Just because you play for the Atlanta Braves and then you move on to the Florida Marlins or the Philadelphia Phillies or the Red Sox doesn't mean you don't know what happens to your team. You'll pick up some stories along the way of what's going on in the old clubhouse, what they're talking about. So the idea that somehow the underworld doesn't know about it, it's a little skewed to me. I just think that everybody sort of knows. And listen, whoever didn't get caught for that crime, good for them. And I hope that's the way that it continues to go. Not that in any way stretch of the imagination, because I'm going to inevitably get a message from somebody saying, "Oh, you're saying killing somebody is good." Listen, and I'm using a street narrative, a street perspective, and that's what I always go with on my show. And I'm just going to leave it there. All right, who are some of the most successful bosses in the history of organized crime that stayed under the radar by using the strategy of having a front boss? Vincent the Chin Gigante is really the mold for that. Listen, he had Tony Salerno running around for him. Tony Salerno gets 100 years. The Chin continues to just do what he does. Russell Buffalino did the same exact thing. We've seen the Bonanos do it, the Lucchese's do it, but I think really, for my money, that the 2 of the most successful ones are Russell Buffalino and Vinny the Chin Gigante, hands down. All right, given the massive influx of cocaine into the Florida area in the 1970s and 80s, how much, if any, involvement, control did the Trafficante crime family have over what was coming in via the Colombian and Cubans? All right, 70s and 80s. You got to start looking in terms of how old Santo Trafficante. At that point, it would have been Santo Trafficante Jr. because Sr. died in 1954. How much control? Probably not a whole lot. I think they could control. You got to look at it. There's a documentary, Cocaine Cowboys. I don't know if it's still on Netflix. There's Cocaine Cowboys 1 and 2. Watch that, and that's going to show the Miami area in the 70s and 80s and how fucking crazy it was. It's 2 great, phenomenal documentaries. I don't think the mob had much control at that point. Listen, when they're killing people in broad fucking daylight with machine guns in Florida, outside of malls and parking garages, there's little the mob can do at that point but step aside. Involvement, I would almost say that pre-1970 they got a kickback, but I think after 1970, 71 when this started, I don't think the mob got a kickback. You got to think about how crazy the shit was in Florida. Go to YouTube, type in Cocaine Cowboys, and maybe it's on YouTube. Maybe there's a couple of clips. Watch it, and you'll see what I mean by that. I don't think the Trafficantes had any fucking say in what was going on in that time period. There's just too many Colombians, too many Cuban hitmen. You got Griselda Blanca, who's everywhere. She was... Griselda was not somebody to be fucked with, let me tell you. So I just don't think that the Trafficantes really had any say in any of that. Okay. Do you know if Louisiana Governor Edwin Edwards was in the pocket of Carlos Marcello? When he was governor, he legalized gambling, and I had a friend who owned a bar with a lot of video poker machines, and he claimed the mob controlled them. Is that true? Okay, the first thing is, yes, Edwin Edwards was definitely in the pocket of Marcello. A lot of people were. That's just the reality and the nature of the business. As far as the poker machines, absolutely the mob runs them. That has been around for a long time. And there's sort of a historical reference here. Frank Costello had problems. And this goes back to Fiorello LaGuardia. He really started cracking down on the poker machines, the slot machines, and wanted them gone. So obviously there's the historical footage of LaGuardia throwing shit into the river saying, fuck this, we're not going to have this anymore. And it hurt Costello's pockets deeply because Costello was the guy behind the gambling machines here. And what he ends up doing is, I'm trying to think of who the fucking governor of Louisiana at the time was. I don't want to guess because I don't want to get it wrong. But Costello had a problem, and he needed sort of a shoe-in to put his machine somewhere else. And through this governor, Huey Long? Maybe it was Huey Long. I think it was Huey Long. Ended up introducing Costello more personally to Marcello, who said, yeah, bring your machines. Not a big deal. Not that they didn't know each other. They did, but he used, I believe it was Huey Long. He used him sort of as a middleman. And Marcello got a huge kickback from the machines. So ever since those days of the Joker poker, video poker machines, in Louisiana, it was always Costello's machines. And Marcello protected the racket, and he protected the cops from getting involved in it, and he also allowed Costello to put them all over the city. So is it true that the mob controls them? Absolutely, 100% unequivocally. Now, since both men are deceased, I'm not sure if the New York family still get a kickback from that. I would imagine that they do. But like I said, I'm not obviously in Louisiana. I couldn't tell you, but I can tell you for 100% absolutely unequivocally a fact that they were definitely controlled by the mob. All right. Let's see. All right. Here we go. All right. Who is the more powerful narco, Roberto Suarez or Pablo Escobar? Pablo Escobar, hands down, in my opinion, was the greatest drug dealer of all time. And when I mean greatest, I'm not saying that in a positive light. I'm just saying that he was, I think, the most profitable when we talk about these two. Now, if you want to talk about El Chapo Guzman, that's a totally different story. I think he makes Pablo Escobar look like small time. But Pablo Escobar sort of is the godfather of narcos. So I think for my money, look, the guy had a fucking zoo on his property. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, right? All right. What is your opinion on Larry Lurch Newman? Frank Collada says he's the most... Excuse me, he's the most dangerous man he ever knew. Okay, first of all, Frank Collada's a fucking rat. I don't like him either. I've never liked him. I think he's just a jerk off of epic proportions. And I'm looking for something actually that, okay. If you don't know who Larry the Lurch Newman is, just very quickly, he's a burglar, a robber, an arsonist, a murderer. But his skill was really murder. That's really what he was good at. Larry came from a very wealthy family. He lived off of sort of a stipend every month, so he didn't really need to go into organized crime. He just chose to because he enjoyed it. I mean, that's just the reality. His first 3 hits took place all at once in Chicago in 1956. He used a shotgun to kill a bartender, then he killed the waitress, and as he's leaving, he runs into a newspaper boy, kills him too. And the reason... he felt stiffed on a $2 change. He was supposed to get $2 in change. There was some argument over it, so he killed 3 people over $2. He was arrested, given 125 years in prison, but somehow gets paroled in 11 years. While he's in prison, he meets Frank Collada, and when Frank sort of gets released in 74, he hooks up with Newman. They do a couple jobs, but really that was the extent of it. Then in 79, Collada heads out to Vegas to work for Tony Spilatro, and Tony asked Frank to put together a crew, i.e. the Hole in the Wall gang, and Frank's first choice obviously was Newman, and eventually we know that Frank Collada ends up testifying. He ends up putting Newman in prison for the rest of his life, gets convicted of 8 hits and dies in 2007. So, was he a scary guy? Absolutely. But I have a hard time buying anything that Frank Collada says. I really do. That's just the truth. I think you sort of lose Any sort of edge you have of being a truth teller, you lose when you're accepting a lesser sentence for telling on people. That's just me. Okay. Why didn't Anastasia make a move on Genovese immediately after the attempted hit on Frank Costello? The hit was unsanctioned, so if Genovese broke the rules, it should have given Anastasia the green light. Was it because Anastasia broke so many rules himself that he feared getting whacked if he fucked up? Why didn't the commission act? I wish I could give you a reasonable answer. At that point, there were things that were working behind the scenes with Genovese and Gambino. So I think what would have happened, even if Anastasia wanted to act and wanted to go to the commission with it, I don't think he could have, because I think that Genovese and Gambino had already sort of laid the seeds that Anastasia was going to go. And maybe Anastasia just... I don't know. I can't tell you why he wouldn't react immediately, why he wouldn't do anything, but I do and can say that it has nothing to do with Anastasia being being fearful of anybody. This guy ran Murder Inc. He was a tough guy. He was well respected. There's no way he was going to be afraid of Vito Genovese. There might have been some sort of back idea thought that Gambino might move on him, but I don't think that Anastasia really believed that, because if he had, he never would have put himself in a position like going to the Park Sheraton Hotel by himself. I think that's just the reality of it. But as far as why he didn't act, this all relatively happened in a very, very short period of time. So I really don't know. Why didn't the commission act? I'm not sure. The same argument can be made of why the commission didn't act when Sammy Gravano killed a 17-year-old kid named Alan Kaiser. Why wasn't Gravano killed immediately after that? That's what should have happened. That is exactly what should have happened. Gravano should have been killed immediately for that action. He wasn't, and we're never going to know. All right. I've noticed many of the 5 families have Jersey crew representation. I've read articles that say certain guys are bosses, like it's separate from a separate family with an underboss, a captain, soldiers, etc. How does that work? It really doesn't work like you think. Listen, the 5 families, most crime families have operatives working in other cities and states. They are the representation of their family. So if you've got a Lucchese crew working in Jersey, their Lucchese crew oversees themselves. But if they have an issue, then they go to their people, and that's just how it works. But it's not a different family. It's just everybody working in a territory sort of together. That's just the easiest way that I can explain it. Has there anyone not based in New York who has been at the top of the administration for any of the 5 families? Yeah, Lucky Luciano. He was at the top of the administration. Was living in exile in Cuba and in Italy. So that's the top guy that I can think of. Are the Genoveses still blocking the Bonanno bid to get their seat back on? To my knowledge, the Bonannos have a seat on the commission. How long that's sort of been back active, I'm not sure. But from what I heard and from what I know, they do have a seat back on the commission. All right, in the mob, if you don't take the contract and off somebody once asked, then the mob will put a hit on you. So then why was it so hard for them to take out Roy DeMeo? Shouldn't the first person you tell have to take it? Was anybody killed for refusing to kill Roy? Was Roy too much for Dela Croce? First of all, Dela Croce died. That's the first thing. The second thing is the hit was immediately given. There's been a lot of rumor it was given to Gotti and Gotti proffered to somebody else, but that's not true. It was immediately a situation where fucking Castellano said, Nino Gaggi, you brought him into this bullshit. You take him out. It's your responsibility. Use your crew. I'm sure that initially they tried to go with a different crime family to sort of just lay off the suspicion that they did it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Nino Gaggi was told to do it, and that's exactly what he did. Once again, if a crime family tells you to hit somebody, they kill you, that's sort of a wives' tale. I think that was the way it was, say, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, but I think post-65, 66, that was pretty much it. I think that the reality is that sometimes we rely too much on what the FBI tells us, what makes them a fucking authority on the mob from the inside. It doesn't. And I think that for the sake of this question, you know, Roy DeMeo, it's not like people were afraid to kill him. In fact, Roy knew he was going to be killed. He goes to the meeting anyway. So this idea that people were so petrified of him that they kept turning down the contract is bullshit. It's not true. Nino Gaggi was told to handle it. He did with Anthony Center and Joey Testa, and that's just the end of it. Was Roy too much for Dela Croce? Absolutely not. If Dela Croce had been alive, believe me, Dela Croce immediately would have killed him. That'd have been it. All right. Who do you think is one of the most unknown but should be known bosses, the most underrated? I've said this before, and I will say it again. I think two: Santo Trafficante Jr., who we're going to talk about today, and I think Russell Bufalino. Russell Bufalino was very, very, very well unknown. He's not going to be the topic. If you walk into a restaurant and have a mob conversation, he's not going to be the first guy you're going to come up with. Tony Salerno, who really he was a street boss, but Tony Salerno, for my money, Russell Bufalino, and Santo Trafficante Jr. absolutely were the most underrated and unknown, I think, in general terms. All right. I saw a documentary that said Frankie DiCiccio was the brains behind John Gotti. That he taught John Gotti how to run the family. Absolutely not true. I don't know where that information came from. Frankie was a good guy. God rest his soul. He was not the brains behind John Gotti. You got to remember, John Gotti came up under Carmine Fatico. That guy was no fucking joke. He schooled John Gotti. Then John Gotti gets with Neil Dela Croce. You mean to tell me that he needed Frankie D to teach him how to run things, and he came up under Carmine Fatico? Are you fucking kidding me? So no, I don't know where, and when I say it the way I say it, I'm not criticizing the person that asked. I just don't understand why a documentary would say it that way, and I think that's just another way that these documentaries sort of try to undercut who John Gotti was. But no, he didn't need Frankie to teach him how to add. He didn't need Frankie to teach him how to act. John Gotti was John Gotti for a reason. Being around Carmine Fatico and Neil Dela Croce, if you weren't a gangster before, you were once you were around them. And so no, absolutely not. All right. Did any of the Bonanno bosses try to get Joe? I don't know if you're talking about Joe Bonanno or if you're talking about Joey Messina. I don't know I don't know which one you're talking about. If you're talking about Joe Bonanno, no, it didn't happen. Joey Messina, no, didn't happen. It was too hot of a topic, too much of a problem. Nobody was going to waste their time. Joe Bonanno was shelved effectively. That was over with, and Joe Messina went into WITSEC. So, all right. I know you hate Henry Hill. I don't hate Henry Hill. A lot of people think I hate Henry Hill. He's a rat. I don't like him. He's full of shit, but hate's a strong word. There's others I hate that are at the top of my list besides that prick. But he sort of slipped up in a Howard Stern interview and admitted to killing somebody. Do you know anything about that? Here's what I will tell you, and I am not in any stretch of the imagination trying to give Henry Hill any credit for anything. However, I'm going to tell you this. Let's use our objective brains here. Henry Hill was around Paul Vario, Tutti Vario, Tommy DeSimone, Jimmy Burke. Do you really think that Henry Hill wasn't involved in those murders? You really think that Henry Hill wasn't culpable in some sense of the word with helping disposing of a body? Now, if you're talking about how many guys did Henry Hill shoot himself, I don't think necessarily. Maybe a handful of times, maybe twice. I know of one that's up in the upper 90% that he did it. The other one's at about 40%. But if you think that he did not actively participate in the shit Tommy did, the shit that fucking Jimmy Burke did, the shit that Tutti Vario did, then you're out of your mind. You cannot be around killers like Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, Tutti Vario, and Tommy DeSimone without killing somebody or without being involved. You really think that they would let Henry Hill just get a pass on that? Henry, don't worry about it. We're going to kill this guy. You just go outside while we kill him. Do you really think that's the way it went down? So I think the question's a good question. I think Henry Hill more than likely was involved in 10 to 12 murders, depending on, I'm not saying he was the active shooter, but maybe one of them. But Henry Hill, believe it or not, was so close to Jimmy Burke, Tutty Vario, and and Tommy DeSimone. I don't think there's any way you don't attach those murders to him. Now, he's claimed in many, many, many different stories he never killed nobody, never had nothing to do with it. Bullshit. When you're around those kind of guys, I would say it's almost fucking impossible. That's like saying you're around Hitler and you didn't know what he was doing. Come on, You're with the guy 24/7. You didn't once do something. So I think the reality is he absolutely did. And if you look from Henry Hill's perspective, and I don't want to get into, I got to be very careful here. Henry is a blowhard in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, Henry isn't. I think that Henry was a tortured guy. I think Henry had a lot of fucking guilt on the shit that he did. And I think that people that are just around people that murder is one thing. People that are actively involved in it, it fucking destroys them. And then when you start looking at the psychoanalysis of it all, of Henry being a drug addict and all drinking nonstop and all this other stuff, you got to kind of wonder why. So I think it's safe to admit and safe to say that I think that Henry Hill was definitely involved in a lot of murders. All right. Is it true that Nicky Scarfo tried taxing the Bagans? Yeah, he tried and failed miserably. He tried, but he failed. All right. Why didn't they put Sammy Gravano at Altoona? They call that if you don't know, they call that the Valachi Suite. Philip Leonetti was there. Why not put it in the Gremlin? Probably the reality of why Sammy Gravano didn't go to Altoona. And who said he didn't? I don't know if he did or he didn't. But I think the reality is that if they didn't, it was because he was too high profile. That he's more high profile than Philip Leonetti. He's more high profile than Joe Valachi. Sammy Gravano was one of the more high profile guys you're ever going to come across. He's he's a scumbag rat fuck, but that's probably realistically why he didn't. It's just because he was too high profile. Okay, next question. Could you tell me a story that maybe we haven't heard before or very limited information about? Yeah, one of my favorite mob stories, I've got a bunch of them, but one of my favorite ironic ones is Albert Anastasia having Arnold Schuster whacked. If you haven't heard this story, it's a pretty good... If you look at this from a perspective of fucking like retribution and thumbing your nose at a fucking rat and a squealer and a nothing, then this has an ironic twist to it. Arnold Schuster was actually a close salesman, and he was sort of a wannabe amateur detective. He was known for his involvement in the capture of bank robber by the name of Willie Sutton. Now, Willie Sutton's famous for a lot of different things. Willie Sutton was a big bank robber, and this story is just, I laugh when I hear it just because, it's morally probably very wrong, but it sort of is like, you want to play the game of being a tattletale, you want to play the game of being private investigator, you're going to get what's coming to you. Schuster was a Brooklyn resident at the time he was 24 years old. He recognized Willie Sutton, who's a wanted bank robber at the time, and he sees him while he's riding on the subway in February of 1952. Schuster basically follows Sutton off the train and sort of sees him go into a garage. Schuster immediately goes and calls the police, and he notifies them where Sutton was, which resulted in Sutton getting arrested. This was sort of covered by the newspaper, and Albert Anastasia catches wind of this, who's absolutely fucking furious at the idea that any little prick couldn't just mind his own fucking business, go about his life, and just not drop a dime on somebody. Anastasia ends up calling a couple of guys, and they go looking for him, and they can't find him at first. Then Schuster fucking ups the ante by going on national television and admits what he did and talks about himself like he's a fucking crime solver. Anastasia goes fucking nuts and says, I want this prick dead. He's a squealer, he's a rat, etc., etc. And basically, Anastasia said something to the extent that he hated rats and that Sutton fucked the government and the banks, not ordinary citizens. Kill that prick. And he ends up getting shot twice in the dick, or the prick, however you want to say it. He gets shot in the prick twice and once in each eye. So I think that the rest assured Anastasia just did not respect anybody that could tell on anybody else. He thought that Willie Sutton was a bank robber. Listen, he's only fucking the government and banks. Nobody is personally getting hurt by this. And here comes this little fucking looky-loo, this little fucking tattletale rat think. He's going to drop a dime on Sutton? Not a problem. I'll just have him killed, little prick. And by coincidence, Al Capone actually shot himself in the dick twice, believe it or not. So that's a little mob war for you. Now, I have a bunch of other questions, and I just can't get to it because I still have to get to Santo Trafficante Jr. Anybody who submitted questions, if I didn't get to your questions, I'll definitely get to them next week. Daryl Vanover, I've got your questions. I meant to get to them, but they were on my phone, and my phone is off because, as you heard earlier in the show, it was banging left and right. John Gotti III is fighting in Lincoln, Rhode Island, November 2nd. If you're unfamiliar with John Gotti III, he is an MMA fighter with CES. Lincoln, Rhode Island, the Twin Rivers Casino, great venue, great place to see a fight. John Gotti is 2-0 as a professional fighter. His fights have not lasted long. John Gotti does not fuck around. He gets in, he ends it, and that's the end of it. There's going to be a huge Gotti contingency there. I will be there in person. So if you're there, come by and see me. I'm recognizable. You'll just see me with my bulldog friend. But if you're a fan of MMA or you're a fan of John Gotti, go get tickets to this event. I do not know if the tickets are on sale as of yet, but you can check with Twin Rivers Casino. I believe it's Friday, November 2nd in Lincoln, Rhode Island. If you're from New York and never been to Rhode Island, you'll love Rhode Island. It's a great place. If you're from Providence, Warwick, even if you're from Boston, Worcester, wherever you're from, either in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, make sure you get tickets to the fight. Come see the fight. A lot of people might gripe. Listen, everything in life is entertainment. Everything in life can be expensive. Sometimes it's not. It's a great venue to see a fight. Come out and support John Gotti III on November 2nd in Lincoln, Rhode Island. Also, before we take a break and come back to do Santo Trafficante Jr., make sure you give Scott Williams Collier's YouTube page a like. He's my partner in a lot of the stuff that I do. He covers serial killers for the most part. He is going to be doing the Cray twins. If you're unfamiliar with them, you're not going to want to miss his next podcast. In fact, I did an interview on his podcast last week. Go to YouTube and type in True Crime Podcast. You'll pull it up and enjoy it. Scott's obviously, he's from outside of Manchester, England. So if you hear his voice and it doesn't sound like a New York voice, that's why. He does good work. He's a great photographer. He's got his own photography thing up. Check him out on Twitter too at True Crime Page, or I think at True Crime Podcast. If not, go to my Twitter and look at who's following me. You'll see him. He also has a web page on Facebook, True Crime Page. He also is a co-writer on some of the blog stuff that we do. So give him a subscribe on YouTube. He's trying to get to like 100 subscriptions. He needs them desperately so he can have more time to do his podcast, because the way that YouTube works is if you don't have that many followers, you can't put like a ton of time. Your shows have to be constricted and confined to a certain amount of time. So please go on fucking YouTube already and just type in True Crime Page and just fucking hit subscribe. Even if you don't want to listen to him. Just do me a solid and subscribe so you get to that fucking 100. Also go over there and check on his page. The interview I did with him is pretty cool. We talked about a lot of different things. It's always good to talk to Scott. He's actually going to be coming over here, I believe, next month. He's flying over and staying with me for a week, and we're going to be all over New York City doing what we do best. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at RealMobTalk7. You can go over to Facebook and type in Mob Talk Radio. Give us a like. Give us a subscription. Send your complaints and threats to the usual places. All that being said, before I take a break, what else did I want to say? Okay, the webpage stuff, really quick. I know I said earlier I was probably going to open up in October. That has changed. Let me tell you the reason why it's changed. One, I kind of want to open the new year with a bang. I want to open the new year with new stuff, new material, and when I started thinking about everything that I want to be on this page the day you open it, I really don't have all that much time. Today's already the fucking 20th of September. It's just not enough time for me to do what I got to do. The webpage takes a lot of time to do. Some of the stuff I want to make sure you get the day you fucking jump on it already. And two, I want to watch YouTube for a little bit. I just want to see how I'm growing and some other things like that. So I think January is probably going to be the more appropriate date to do it. Somebody had asked me, I don't do personal appearances. Who the fuck wants to see me? Listen, I'm not a celebrity. I'm a normal guy. Anybody that meets me outside of this show is sort of shocked that I'm sort of quiet, reserved. I mean, I'm gregarious and loud and everything else, and I don't pull punches. I never have. But anybody that meets me outside of what I do, and I've met plenty of people, they're all like, wow, you're fucking normal. I'm a normal guy. But I also don't engage in like mafia conversation. Well, unfortunately, it's a big part of my life, but I don't engage in it as much as one might think. If I'm eating dinner with my attorney, of course, that's a subject of conversation. It always is. And who do you know? Who do I know? And, what's going on in Philly? And I give them the update, and we just kind of joke around about that. But I don't really do personal appearances, and a lot of people that come into New York send me a message saying they're going to be here and want me to come out and meet you and all that kind of stuff, and I'm going to start doing more of that. But we will have, I believe, a public event. I'm not sure when or where, but I can tell you that it likely will be at Nears. If you don't know what Nears is, look it up. It's where they film Goodfellas. I think that's a good spot. Maybe we'll do like some kind of meet and greet and like throw the money to charity or something, or just, I don't know, get together and have a good time. I think that sounds like a good idea. So we've got a bunch of different things that are planned. Also, once again, if you are unfamiliar with Seth Nicoletti and Tommaso Rosiello and Dominic Figueroa and some of these other guys, Sean King, they are doing a show called Brooklyn Ties. Now, I'm not going to tell you the ins and outs of it because, frankly, I don't know the ins and outs of it. And I think that they best, I think Sean King and Seth Nicoletti and Tommaso Rosiello and Dominic Figueroa, I think they could tell you probably in their own words what the show is about. I don't like to step on toes. I like people to promote their own stuff. But what I can tell you is that it's going to be a really, really good show. And I look forward to seeing it. I'm not specifically sure. A lot of people have asked me when's the first season coming out. I don't have those details. I'm not privy to that conversation. I know it's coming. I know there is another trailer coming, I believe. They've started to release little scenes and stuff like that. And I know they're getting ready to start the second season. It looks to be a fantastic show. I don't want to get sort of, what I'm trying not to do is step on toes and say the wrong thing here. But what I can tell you is it's not necessarily mafia genre, but it is. And when I say it's not, but it is, it means you have to watch it for yourself. Seth Nicoletti, in my opinion, kid can act. Kid's got moxie. Tommaso Rosiello, same thing. Dominic Figueroa, forget about how good he is. So these guys are, listen, they're relatively unknown. They could have taken the path like some of these other creep shows that are running around doing shows. And a lot of people think, oh, they're just guys from fucking Brooklyn or Bensonhurst doing this. It's not true. These guys are good. These guys are good at what they do. I know Seth. He's a good friend of mine. I call him my cousin. Him and Tommaso. They're good guys. So I'm looking forward to that show. Please, please, please go to Facebook and type in Brooklyn Ties. Like them. Subscribe to them. And do me a solid. Make sure, if you like them, put on there, Jeff Canarsie suggested this. That's why I'm here. This is why I like it, and this is not to in any sense glorify me, but I want them to know where it's coming from because we're trying to find out how much sway that I have as far as what I can help people with. It's only important for marketing purposes. I'm just trying to really get the show out there because these are hometown guys, homegrown guys. They're not gangsters. They're hardworking Italian guys. They're not playing a fucking role that is like a wannabe. They're acting. That's what actors do. They act. And I think that there's sometimes a huge disconnect and a misconception. But please, do me a solid. Reach out to Seth Nicoletti, Tommaso Rosiello. Go to Facebook and type in Brooklyn Ties. Reach out to Sean King. Ask him some questions about the show because he's the director and producer of it. And it looks to be a great show, and I'm very excited for Seth, very excited for Tommaso. They're really, really, really good guys. And like I said here, I always promote things that I like. Just because somebody's my friend or they're cool doesn't mean I'm going to support them. Yeah, if they're a friend, you kind of give them a little kick and help them out. But I believe in this. And when I believe in something like I believe in Brooklyn Ties and Sean King and Seth Nicoletti and Tommaso Rosiello, then I'll do anything in my power that I can to help promote. Because that's what it's all about. It's about promoting. People promote me all the time. And I do my best to support them as much as I can. Damian Alfonso Nix, thank you very much for throwing a shout-out on your radio show for me. People go to Facebook and look up Damian Alfonso Nix, N-I-X. He does I believe, a podcast called Kane's something or other. I don't know the exact. I don't want to give you the wrong name of it, but it's Kane something. Look him up. He does a really interesting podcast. He was nice enough to throw a shout out to me. So, all that being said, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into Santo Trafficante Jr. Stand by. In my travels, I'm always looking for a clothing brand that I feel like represents me. Anybody can go to a store and buy a t-shirt with a gimmick, but if you believe in 3 core values like I do, loyalty, honor, and respect, then look no further than Omerta Brand Clothing. You can catch them at omertamia.com, OMERTAMIA.com, with locations in Europe, California, Boston, Brooklyn, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Washington. They have a great clothing line with hats, shirts, sweatshirts, keychains, anything you might need, stickers. You want the rats to stop snitching? Go right out and get yourself a sticker. But if you want to live your life by the gentleman's code, look no further than Omerta Brand Clothing. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We have some breaking news, actually. This is the first time this has ever happened while I was actually recording. Police have made an arrest in the Angelo Musitano hit. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this, last week, Albert Iavarrone was whacked, and they long asserted that he had some sort of involvement and that this was retaliation itself for the Musitano hit. Today we saw arrest in the Angelo Musitano hit. Angelo Musitano was the boss of the Musitano crime family, and he was shot very similarly. He was shot in his driveway, in his truck, by some assailants, and it's long been rumored that there was a beef inside the Ontario Mafia, and that's why Musitano was hit. But today, the RCMP in Hamilton has made an announcement, and what I'm going to do is read you directly from the article that I just posted on our blog, which is Mob Talk Radio True Crime Page.blogspot.com. That's where you can go to get all of our articles. Once again, that's Mob Talk Radio True Crime Page.blogspot.com. And so I'm going to read directly from the article that I posted earlier. Canadian police have announced today that a suspect has been arrested in the 2017 hit of Musitano crime family boss Angelo Musitano and vet tech Mila Barberi. RCMP Hamilton Niagara Detachment have been conducting a joint force investigation on the 2 murders since January. Mila Barberi was gunned down in broad daylight on March 14th of 2017 as she sat in a car parked adjacent to a business on Castor Avenue off Highway 7 and Weston Road. Barberi's boyfriend, Savario Serrano, was also shot in the attack twice but survived. According to the Hamilton police, Barberi was not the intended target, but her boyfriend Serrano was. Serrano's father is well known to be connected to organized crime figures. Musitano was shot to death, obviously outside of his home while sitting in his truck May 2nd of 2017. The investigation, nicknamed Project Scopa, sought 150 warrants and conducted dozens of searches early in 2018. 16 detectives were working on the case full-time. The suspects were responsible for the double homicide, started planning the executions as late as 2016. The suspects used surveillance techniques which the RCMP calls complex. The hit also employed other accomplices to spy on the victims and their families. In May of 2017, 2 months after Barberi was killed and shortly after Musitano was killed, a suspect in the killings identified as Michael Graham Cudmore flew to Cancun, Mexico to join an associate of his named Daniel Raineri. On January 27th, 4 days after the RCMP stated that both murders were somehow connected, another of the 3 suspected men involved, Daniel Mario Tomasetti, flew to Cancun where he did not return as planned. In March of 2018, Rainieri's body was found in a ditch in Cancun, Mexico. Rainieri had been reported as a missing person. A third suspect, identified as Jabril Hassan Abdallah, 27, did not flee the country and was arrested at his home early Wednesday afternoon. He and the other 2 men are wanted for 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. Police are currently talking to Interpol and Mexican authorities to try and apprehend Tomasetti and Cudmore. According to law enforcement, these individuals didn't act on their own, but rather as a bigger part of a larger issue at hand. There's apparently, like I said earlier, a fracture between 2 factions of the mafia in Toronto as well as the GTA. With all the arsons and murders and bombings that have taken place over the last year, there appears to be more now than ever a power vacuum or a power struggle taking place in Canada. The probe is extending to like I said, the recent murder of Al Iavarrone, with Al Iavarrone knowing the 2 men wanted, and he also knew Musitano very well, and one of the alleged shooters as well he was very friendly with. So the parallel is being drawn that somehow Iavarrone had a connection to the murder of Musitano, which might explain retaliation against Iavarrone. So there you go. We've dotted some I's and sort of crossed some T's. And so, like I said, we'll follow the Canadian thing as it comes along, but it looks like the RCMP is definitely making inroads into this case. So that's your breaking news out of Canada. With that, we're going to get to Santo Trafficante Jr. Born November 15th, 1914 in Tampa, Florida, to Santo Trafficante Sr. And Maria Cacciatore. Santo dropped out of high school before the 10th grade. Santo Trafficante Sr. was the man in Florida, the main guy in Florida from the 30s until 1954, and he ran Florida like a well-oiled machine. However, we need to do kind of like a little background here. Tampa crime really started with Charlie Wall, who in the 1920s controlled a bunch of gambling rackets and a lot of corrupt officials. Wall controlled Ybor City. His only competition was Tampa's first mob boss, who was Ignacio Antinori. The Antinoris were the first criminal organization in Florida from the mafia's perspective. The other gang was led by Santo Trafficante Sr. Wall was having issues with Antinori and asked Santo to join his outfit, which he obviously did, and together they took over the highly sought-after Bolita rackets. For a decade, Wall warred with Antinori, with Antinori getting killed in 1942 with a sawed-off shotgun. Because of the war, both Wall and Antinori their respective crews were weakened. They were fighting together, and Santo Trafficante just kind of, left back and just waited to see how that sort of panned out. And ultimately, that would leave Trafficante the most powerful of the 3, and he would begin to take over. Trafficante takes over, like I said, and he begins to bring his son into the fold, Santo Jr. When the Kafafra hearings began in 1950, Charlie Wall would end up testifying in regards to Santo Sr. and Jr. And so what happened was Santo Sr. and Jr. would end up fleeing to Cuba as a result. In 1946, Santo Sr. sent Jr. to Cuba to help operate the mob-controlled casinos. As the hearings would end, both Trafficantes returned to find out that a rival, he really wasn't a rival. He was the boss that was put in charge while the Trafficantes were in Cuba, but he sort of ended up being a rival, and his name was Salvatore Italiano. And what had ended up happening was that they had left Salvatore Italiano in charge. There was a bit of a schism between Italiano and rival Jimmy Lumia. And what ended up happening was Italiano got scared and ended up fleeing to Mexico. So when the Trafficantes came back, they didn't have anybody in charge. And what had happened as a result is there was a power vacuum, and like I said, rival Jimmy Lumia took over. Shortly after, Santo Sr. Ordered the death of Lumia. Lumia was a powerful and hungry guy, and he believed that the Trafficantes sort of ran away from their responsibilities. They were chicken shit. They were afraid of the hearings. And so he sort of shot his mouth off around town that he was the new guy in charge, et cetera, and Lumia indeed would be killed as a result. In 1953, Santo was ambushed. Santo Jr. was ambushed and shot. And what Santo Sr. believed was that Charlie Wall was behind the hit. He felt that Charlie Wall probably felt disrespected by the fact that he sort of brought Trafficante Sr. into the life, and Trafficante Sr. essentially betrayed him. And not only that, but like I said earlier, Wall would testify at the hearings against them anyway. In 1955, Wall was whacked. Santo Sr. would actually die in 1954, officially elevating his son to the official king of the castle, so to speak. Santo Jr. ruled with an iron fist. He's always been regarded as one of the most respected and most powerful mob bosses of the American Mafia. He was a lot more crafty than his father was. I think he was a treacherous guy, but he had more business acumen than his father did, I think. That's my opinion. He maintained strong working ties with the Luccheses and the Bonanos crime family. Santo was especially close with Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese had helped train Santo Jr. and sort of groom him into the lifestyle. As Trafficante's empire would expand, he would end up dumping money into legitimate businesses. He actually owned several bars, restaurants in the Tampa area, several casinos in Cuba, a drive-in, and a bunch of other businesses. Trafficante was also a major player in Cuba, and he was actually at the Havana Conference in December of 1946. For those that don't know about the Havana Conference, we've talked about it a lot, and I'm actually going to talk about it. And one of the things that I talked about over on my page the other day, I'm going to bring up, which started fucking mass hysteria. I'm actually going to bring up. So the Havana Conference took place in December of 1946. It was held in Havana, Cuba, obviously, from December 22nd through the 29th at the Hotel Nacional. And it was a meeting between the U.S. Mafia and the Cosa Nostra leaders that were stationed in Havana, Cuba. The meeting was arranged by Lucky Luciano. The purpose was for a bunch of different things. There's a lot of reasons, but I'm going to hit on really the most four important key issues that were a part of this deal. It had to do with mob policies, rules, business interests, Benny Siegel, who was a problem for them, narcotics. But really the four main parts were Bugsy Siegel had to go. They had casinos they wanted to discuss, narcotics, and then Vito Genovese was a huge fucking problem. And we're going to get to that. The meeting also was sort of a welcome back for Lucky Luciano, who had actually been stuck in Italy. He was exiled from the United States, deported, obviously, and he was back in Cuba. And he just, everybody was just kind of acknowledging the authority that he still had over the mafia. All right, so the first order of business was the position of boss of bosses. Now, this has been a widely discussed topic on this show. Carlo Gambino was supposedly boss of bosses, then Paul Castellano was boss of bosses. I think there was actually a fucking book written about Paul Castellano called Boss of Bosses. I could be wrong. But anyway, in 1931, Lucky Luciano officially eliminated the title because he felt that they should have a panel of people that had a say in what was going on. He wanted to really seriously avoid the trappings that Maranzano and Masseria had, and that one man over everyone else probably wasn't a good idea, because all it does at the end of the day is creates havoc, and it creates problems, and families go to war. And Luciano wanted to avoid that at all costs, which is one of the reasons why the commission came to be known as what it was. In 1932, believe me, Luciano could have claimed the title Boss of Bosses, but he didn't. Everything was fine until Vito Genovese returns from Italy. Vito Genovese had taken off to Italy because he was indicted for murder in New York, didn't want to face the charges, so he took off. Eventually, Genovese comes back. Now, when Genovese left, he was a captain. When he came back, he was a captain, but he really made it no secret that it was his intention to take over the Luciano crime family And in 1946, when Luciano was deported, Frank Costello had officially been given the title of boss, and that just infuriated Genovese because he felt like he deserved it. The next issue was narcotics, and we're going to come back to the Genovese thing here in a second. But the next issue was narcotics. Luciano felt that there was too much money to pass up. Since the 1920s, Cuba basically, since the 1920s, Cosa Nostra had been importing drugs, heroin, coke, marijuana, into North America. In the 1930s, the mob began transporting narcotics from the East Asia Golden Triangle, which was Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, where the Myanmar meets the confluence of the Ruak and the Mekong rivers, and it also ran through Afghanistan. They wanted transport lanes from the Triangle all the way to South America, then to Cuba, then to Florida, then to New York. But because they owned the Cuban government, they could actually use Cuba sort of as a layover port, a smuggling point, just sort of a central location. They could store the drugs, pick them up, put them on ships, which would head to Canada, then to the United States via Montreal, and then Florida, then to main ports. With Luciano deported, he sort of was in a very rare situation. He could actually begin, because he wasn't in the United States, he could import heroin from North Africa via Italy, then to Cuba, into the United States, into Canada. Luciano had forged ties with Sicilian bosses in Italy, and the plan was for narcotics to travel from North Africa into Cuba, then shipped to ports that the mob controlled in the United States, those ports primarily being New York City, New Orleans, and Florida. The Lucianos would end up controlling the New York docks with the Manganos. In New Orleans, Carlos Martello would take that over, and in Tampa, Santo Trafficante Jr. would take over. These routes are actually still used today. It also had to do with the French Connection. If you look deep historically into these routes, the French Connection and the Pizza Connection as well still use those routes, and still today, it's highly sought after, those routes, because everything that comes into this country from Afghanistan seems to filter in through Montreal. So you're always going to see shit happen right on the border between Canada and the United States, because it's a very powerful territory to be in. All right, the third issue was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Look, Benny Siegel has an idea, and he goes to Lansky and he says, look, I got this great idea of a casino in Vegas. It's legal there. Prostitution is legal there. We need a place where the Hollywood elite and the rich and the gangsters can go, where they're really not going to be fucked with. There really wasn't anything like that, and it was really an ingenious idea. A lot of people have called Benjamin Bugsy Siegel the Godfather of Las Vegas. The initial idea was his, but I think it was Meyer Lansky and others that really took that to the next level. But the mob had already been in Las Vegas, and the reason why I say that is because they had already been there for years, because they were trafficking in narcotics from Mexico through Las Vegas to L.A. and etc. So those route lines were already drawn prior to Bugsy Siegel's sort of, until Bugsy Siegel got to Las Vegas. With Meyer Lansky's help, Siegel sold the idea to New York and Chicago. They needed funding, and Bugsy Siegel had power, but he didn't have the kind of power to go to. Him and Luciano were very good friends, but it was Lansky who needed to make the call and to get the financing. And what ends up happening is they end up all agreeing to invest in it, and the Flamingo, as it's known, began to be built. Siegel mistakenly makes a bunch of fucking mistakes, and he tells the New York and Chicago bosses that a hotel, a casino, was going to be super profitable. And he was right in a sense. Eventually, yes, it does become we know what Vegas has become. But the other issue, besides him making a promise he really couldn't keep, was that the Flamingo ran into huge problems. The first one is Bugsy Siegel appoints Virginia Hill, that skank, to oversee the project. And because of that, what contractors ended up doing were stealing. They were overcharging for labor, and there were constant delays. These contractors even would sell Bugsy Siegel materials one day, that night go back and steal the materials, and then the next day approach him again and sell them back to him at a huge profit. With the rising cost of materials and labor, the project originally was set at $1.5 million, but it ended up escalating to almost $6 million. To make the situation worse, Benny Siegel and Virginia Hill were taking a cut off the top. They were skimming. Meyer Lansky really was started to worry about just the rising costs, ended up doing a little research, and he finds out that Virginia Hill was taking luxurious and expensive trips to Switzerland, and what she was doing was depositing large amounts of money into a bank in Zurich. The mob at that time believed that Siegel effectively was skimming, and that the reason why him and Virginia Hill were putting money into a bank in Switzerland is that if the Flamingo failed, he would have enough money hidden in Switzerland to run. Luciano is furious and says, let's take a vote. And everybody votes to kill Benny Siegel. Chicago was given the hit to oversee it, and then the hit was then handed to Jack Dragna, who ran Los Angeles, who handed it to Frankie Carbo of the Lucchese's. However, Bugsy Siegel gets a lifeline because the partially completed casino would open, and Lansky says, listen, guys, let's give it a chance to see if we can make any money out of this. The opening night was an absolute flop and enraged mobsters to no end, and they once again asked for Luciano to fucking kill Benny Siegel. Lansky again goes to them and says, hold off. Let's hold off here. After 2 weeks, the Flamingo then closed down again, and construction began again. It would open months later, making a very small profit, but the mob had enough. And you obviously know what happened. Benny Siegel would be killed June 20th in 1947, and it's long been rumored that Virginia Hill was the one who gave up Benny Siegel. She's the one because Benny Siegel was waiting for her to come home, and it's long been rumored that she effectively gave the information to ensure that he would be there. I can't prove it, but that's the way it is. Okay, the fourth major issue, and the one that's been highly debated on the radio show, and yes, we are still talking about Trafficante, so don't get crazy, is Vito Genovese. Despite Genovese's desires, Luciano met with him sort of one-on-one at the Hotel Nacional. Genovese then told Luciano that the United States knew about Cuba. They knew that Luciano was there. They knew that Luciano was also selling narcotics, and that eventually the United States was going to pressure Cuba to throw him out of Cuba. Since Luciano, if he gets thrown out of Cuba, is going to have to return to Italy, that it would be in his best interest to fucking retire and to hand the family over to Genovese. Whether Genovese was lying and trying to add pressure to Luciano could be debatable on both sides. The reality is that Vito Genovese tipped off the U.S. government as well as Joe Bonanno. Now, I didn't want to get into this whole debate because we've got to get back to Trafficante. But let me finish this portion of it so you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so Luciano believed that Genovese had tipped off the U.S. government. Luciano lost his shit, and he ends up beating the shit out of Genovese in the hotel room. It was so bad that it took him 4 days to recover physically until he could leave. And Luciano warned him before he left that if he ever uttered a fucking word about any of it, he would be killed. Bottom line. In February of 1947, the U.S. government goes after Luciano in Cuba. And basically what the U.S. was saying was, you have a narcotics trafficker in Cuba. He's been related to murders here, narcotics in the United States. Cuba played dumb. Well, we don't know what you're talking about. We can't locate him. We don't know anything. So the U.S. government goes back to Harry Truman and talks to him. And there were negotiations that were going on between Truman and what he could do to help facilitate Cuba expelling Lucky Luciano. And what ends up happening is Joe Bonanno goes to the New York newspapers and to other news outlets and tells them exactly where Luciano is living, like an address. So now that the U.S. has an address, they send someone over to verify that Luciano is technically in Cuba, where Bonanno says he was. And the truth is, he was there. So now the U.S. has proof. They once again contact the Cuban authorities, explain it, say, look, we got this guy's fucking address. Cuba still just kind of plays dumb. They go back to Harry Truman again, and Truman says, I got a great idea. We're going to cut off all medical supplies to Cuba, which Cuba really needed at the time. We were the ones that were supplying Cuba with very, very, very needed medical supplies. Cuba at this point has their fucking hands tied because they need the medical supplies. Without it, they can't help anybody. And so what ends up happening as a result of that is the Cubans caved and deported Luciano. Luciano always believed the Genovese and Bonanno were behind it. Not only did Genovese tip off the U.S. government to Luciano's whereabouts in Cuba, but like I said earlier, it was also Joe Bonanno who tipped off local newspapers to Luciano's whereabouts, which brings us to a bigger issue of once Luciano's gone, he sort of gets rendered is neutered in a sense because Costello takes over. Genovese makes a move, gets Vinny the Chin to try to take out Costello. Costello sees the writing on the wall, lets it go. Genovese takes over. Genovese calls the fucking Apalacan meeting. It was his fucking idea because he wanted to get recognized as boss of all bosses. He's the one that wanted everyone to pay respects to him. And ultimately, Costello, Luciano, and Gambino would have the last laugh on Genovese. But the truth is that Vito Genovese was a rat. Now, when I say rat, we're talking about a different form of rat. If you were to sit and talk to my lawyer, he'd say, look, if you're a street guy and you rat against another guy who gets time served and you don't go to jail, that's a rat move. In this situation, he would probably tell me it's not a rat move, but it is. But at the same time that I say that Bonanno is a rat and Genovese is a rat, we also have to say this, that Gambino did the same shit, Luciano did the same shit. In fact, when Luciano was a teenager, he got caught on a drug charge and informed on other people, and he got basically his charges were wiped out. So the truth is, all of these guys did this. This isn't like just, Vito Genovese is the only one who did it. It only gets amplified with him and Bonanno because those two started so much shit. Bonanno didn't think for one fucking second that he had to listen to what the mob said. He tried to take out Carlo Gambino and the rest of the bosses. Thank God that Joe Colombo came along and told Gambino what was going on. Then when Bonanno is sent for to come in to talk about it, he refuses and fakes his kidnapping, and we kind of know the rest is being him getting shelved from the mob. But the reality is that Bonanno was a very, very, very smart and ingenious guy. He was very capable. The problem is that he thought he was above everybody else. Vito Genovese was the same exact fucking way. The same way. He thought he should be recognized as the all-supreme motherfucker, king of the fucking hill, and he wasn't. And it was ultimately his fucking greed with the drugs that would get him pinched, but it was somebody dropped a dime. I don't know whether it was Costello, Luciano, or fucking Gambino, but the trap was laid, believe me. And I'm sure that Genovese spent a lot of time in prison angry at a lot of different people. So if we take that sort of narrative and that spin on things and we draw like a roadmap, right, it makes sense. It's all about betrayal. There is no honor amongst thieves. This idea that the mafia is the Godfather is ridiculous. People, stop it with the Godfather. It's opera. That's all it is an operatic fairy tale. Yes, there was honor in those days, but the more that we keep talking about these things in general, the more you keep seeing that at every fucking possible turn, somebody is fucking somebody else in the ass. And to even further that point, and believe me, I'm getting to Trafficante, just give me a little space here, all right? Is that I'm trying to make the point that at the end of the day, none of these guys follow the fucking rules. None of them do. Luciano had Masseria and Maranzano killed for his own benefit. Then he installs a rule that you don't kill a boss. It's a little ironic, don't you think? Carlo Gambino kills Albert Anastasia in partnership with Genovese. And how that worked was Genovese comes to Gambino and says, listen, you're in your 40s. Albert Anastasia's a young guy. He's probably going to outlast. By the time you're boss, you're going to be 90 years old. What the fuck is the point? Gambino hears him and kind of agrees. And Gambino has to wonder to himself, what the fuck is his point? What's he getting at? What's his benefit? The benefit to him was he needed Carlo to back him up so that he could take a shot at Costello. Because if he takes a shot at Costello and Carlo's backing him up, then that whole Anastasia getting retribution against Genovese for doing it is null and void. So basically it's, hey, I'm going to take a run. I'm going to take over this family. You kill Anastasia, you'll take over, so you'll get your family, I'll get mine, and the rest is beautiful. But Carlo was smarter than Genovese. Carlo never fucking trusted him. Carlo never trusted him. And moving forward, if you even want to move that forward into the 80s, Della Croce was under fucking Anastasia. He was a part of that group. And that's why Della Croce never trusted Gambino. Now, Della Croce went along with the boss is the boss is the boss. But he never trusted Gambino. Never. And that's one of the reasons why Carlo didn't elevate him to boss when he was dying, and he elevated Paul. He thought that it should have been in the family, and he kind of had this inkling about Della Croce too. And Paul definitely didn't trust Della Croce at all. So that goes back history. So the point I'm trying to make is look at everybody that killed the boss. So people jump on the John Gotti thing. Oh, he killed the boss. It was so out of fucking line. Vincent Gigante tried to kill Costello. He tried to kill a boss. Okay, he fucked up. He couldn't shoot straight. Gotti does it, and everybody wants to jump on Gotti saying how that was out of line and wrong. Why? Listen, this is the streets. This isn't like fucking government and politics. The streets. He with the biggest gun and the most bullets wins. That's the reality. So how people can fucking honestly look at me and say, well, what Gotti did was, He did the same thing that everybody else prior to him fucking did. Bonanno tried to kill all of them. And you could say, well, that was a different time period. Not really. It's the same philosophy. The rule was you don't kill a boss. That's why there wasn't a boss of bosses. That's why there's a whole fucking commission. That's why you got to get permission. Did Genovese get permission from the commission to fucking try to kill Costello? No. Why should Gotti have to? Did Gambino get permission to whack Anastasia? No. Why should he? The difference is that John Gotti did. John Gotti did. So, realistically, if you're going to make an archetype for the mob, and I know I got on a rabbit trail here, but if you're going to make an archetype for the mob, they all do the same shit. There's no honor amongst thieves. It's a backstabbing, greedy fucking thing. They will kill their best friends, their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, whatever. Not their sisters. But that's just the reality of living the streets. That's that lifestyle. You join that life, that's what you accept. So the idea here is just simply saying that just because I say the Genovese told the government something does make him a rat. But there are a whole bunch of others that did the same shit. So I'm only making him a mark in this fucking sense because of what he did after the fucking fact. He did that to Luciano. It was all a power play. I'm going to get Luciano thrown out of Cuba. And I think secretly he thought that if he could get Luciano out of Cuba, then he could totally take over, which is what happens. Because he goes right at Costello because he knows Costello is touchable. He can get to Costello. So it's all, and then he goes to Gambino and irons out the Anastasia shit. So if you look at it, it's a very well played sort of game. And I've always said that Genovese was very, very, very intelligent. His problem was his ego. He broke every rule that there was, and he played it out. And in the end, he got outplayed by those around him. So I can't say what he did was any worse than what anybody else has done. But the reality is that he did tell the government shit. That's the truth. It's absolutely a fucking fact. People don't like to hear that because they want to make this thing that, oh, he didn't get on a stand and testify. I didn't say he did. But the reality is, if you go to tell on somebody else to give yourself an advantage, you're a fucking rat. All right, so now that we've gotten that all dispatched, throughout the 1950s, Trafficante would actually be arrested on charges of bribery and running illegal bolita lotteries in Tampa. He escaped conviction all but once, receiving a 5-year sentence for bribery in 1954, but his conviction would be overturned by the Florida Supreme Court before he began serving his sentence. During the reign of Bautista, Trafficante openly operated the Sanssouci and the Casino International gambling establishments in Cuba. As a leading member of the syndicate, he also had hidden interests in Cuban casinos, mainly the Hotel Habana, Riviera, the Tropicana Club, the Sevilla Biltmore, the Capri Hotel Casino, the Commodore, the Deauville, the Havana Hilton, and Batista, who was owned by the mob at the time, got a 10% kickback from each one of those fucking hotels and casinos. So it was in Batista's best interest to be on the take. But unfortunately, that wouldn't last. Obviously, no, because Fidel Castro does what he does. In 1957, Trafficante was arrested with 56 others at the Appalachian meeting. Charges would later be dropped. The main purpose of the meeting was to deal with the power vacuum that was left by the hit on Albert Anastasia. But like I said, once again, we see Vito Genovese calls this meeting, and Joe Bonanno secretly avoided this meeting. And I've long suspected, and this is my assumption, and this is not a fact, but this is what I'm going to tell you. I think Joe Bonanno played a really good card here. I think Joe Bonanno alerted the police. I've never believed that some fucking highway patrolman's driving along and pulls over a guy for speeding and sees New York plates and goes, well, one, you're in fucking New York, so why would a New York plate be any different than others? Okay, so he sees a Chicago plate. How is that any different? How many times you're going to drive down a freeway, see a Virginia plate, a fucking North Carolina plate, a Florida plate, a California plate, a Chicago plate? So I've never believed that this fucking dumb luck cop is driving by and just says, I'm not sure about this. I'm seeing a lot of New York plates. You're in New York, you dumb fuck. And somehow that leads to him finding Joe Barbara's house? Do the math here, people. Think about this really hard and clear. This guy, and I'm going to play it out one last time. This highway patrolman is driving his beat, pulls over a guy with Chicago plates, gives him a ticket, whatever. Sees a bunch of New York plates. How is that irrelevant? This took place in upstate New York, for the love of God. That's not even relevant. And how does him noticing that lead to him finding Joe Barbara's estate, where suddenly he shows up with 30 fucking cops? Do the math here. Think about this logically. There's no fucking way it happens like that. I have long suspected that Joe Bonanno, who was in big trouble with them already, dropped a fucking dime. How do you like that? If it wasn't Joe Bonanno, it was somebody else. And the only reason why I say that is because of his actions prior to this, his actions during this, and definitely his actions after the fact. They were furious with him for wanting to fucking kill a lot of other bosses. He refused to show up. He faked a kidnapping. All this kind of crazy shit that he did. He was trying to take over everything. He doesn't show up to this thing. And all of a sudden, the 30, 40 cops show up? Like, seriously? And think about who's arrested. The who's who of the fucking mafia. All the bosses are there. And what does Joe Bonanno secretly want? He wants to take over the whole fucking thing, right? Never a better chance in the world. You're never going to... That's giving it to you on a silver fucking platter. You mean I can have them all arrested and take over? They'll all go to jail? So I've long believed that Joe Bonanno had everything to do with that. There's going to be those that are going to disagree with me 100%. But that's really where I think we're at with this. I think that he ultimately is the one that dropped a dime. Because there's no fucking way just some fucking cop driving along stumbles onto the biggest mob convention ever. I mean, come on. Let's be realistic. Now, if you guys have any theories about who you think might have done it, reach out to me at Real Mob Talk 7 or go to our Facebook page and message me there. But I still think, it's never been proven, but I still think that Joe Bonanno had something to do with that. It's not Genovese, because Genovese never would have fucking gone to begin with. But you also have to look at the fact that Bonanno and Genovese were sort of in cahoots, and Genovese would have been a real strong problem for Bonanno if he tried to take over Genovese's action. And Genovese would have killed him, straight up killed him, wouldn't even hesitated. So, maybe you get to kill them all in one deal. That's just my philosophy, and that's what I think. Okay. In 1958, Trafficante is questioned by the Cuban police regarding the Appalachian meeting. A report was made by the Cuban police in January 23rd of 1958, which included transcripts of long-distance phone calls made from the San Soci between August and December of 1957. The DA was given a copy, and on January 23rd, 1958, the Cuban Department of Investigation said that Santo was a registered alien. See, what was happening was Santo was trying to, granted he was picked up and arrested, but he was trying to make the argument that it wasn't him, it was a mistaken identity, that he lived in Cuba, and that he wasn't there. And Cuba pretty much backs him up by falsifying paperwork saying that he was a resident of Cuba and there's no way he could have been there. And here's phone records stating that he was making calls from Cuba there to New York. He wasn't, it was just a way for him to try to get away from the mess. After Fidel Castro's Revolutionary Guard seized the assets, this is a big thing here too. Obviously, we saw it in The Godfather. History, we noted. If you read Havana Nocturne by T.J. English, you'll get more in depth with this. But what ends up happening is Castro invades Cuba, overthrows Batista, wants the mob out. The one thing he does is he steals the assets from Trafficante's businesses and basically throws them out. Then what happens as a result? First of all, Trafficante's furious because not only is he allegedly a resident of Cuba, but now he's just lost probably 75% of his income was based in Cuba. And he just lost every single bit of it, and he's absolutely furious. And what ends up happening is he gets approached by U.S. intelligence officers via Johnny Roselli. Now, I could sit here for the next 5 hours going into this, but let's make it very short and sweet as far as this goes. Johnny Roselli was the one who was approached by officers, and the reason why is because what's that noise? Because Johnny Roselli had property in Florida that the government was using to train dolphins and et cetera, and some other things that were going on. And the U.S. government needed a way to get into Cuba. They knew the mafia had first of all, they knew two things. One, the mob was pissed they lost the casinos. The second thing that they knew was that the mob had a lot of contacts inside of Cuba. So it wouldn't be abnormal for a gangster to still be left over in Cuba. The U.S. government wanted Fidel Castro dead, and they wanted the mafia's help. In 1975, the CIA declassified a report confirming that Trafficante had been persuaded to poison Castro. It was Trafficante who has brought the contract. Roselli brings him in. The U.S. government says, look, we want him dead. We think because you have alien resident status, allegedly, that you can easily get in there. Maybe you could hire some anti-Fidel Castro people, and they can slip him a cigar. They can slip poison into his food and get rid of this. Piece of shit. And then in 1976, Cuban rat. This part of it gets a little weird. In 1976, Cuban exile and rat Jose Alman told the Washington Post that in September of 1962, Trafficante offered him $1.5 million to help rebuild his shabby hotel. He said that Trafficante complained to him that the Kennedys were liars, and that Ailman told Trafficante that he was wasting his time yelling about him because Kennedy would be reelected. And Trafficante laughs, and he laughs and says, no, he won't. He's getting hit. And then what happens right after that is Alman runs to the FBI with his information, but the FBI ignores it. Now, we have to understand why Trafficante would even have that conversation with Guy. I don't believe this conversation ever took place, but if it did, let's give a theory on why. Here's the first thing. Okay, John F. Kennedy could not get elected in Chicago, could not get elected in southern swing states. The reason why is because he was an Irish Catholic. First of all, Catholic was a bad thing to be in those days. And John F. Kennedy was known, but relatively unknown. He was a newcomer to politics for the most part in certain ways. To make a comparison, as much as some people get angry at this, look at Barack Obama. Same sort of thing here, okay? Joe Kennedy, the father, who had made all his money from narcotics trafficking, gun dealing, bootlegging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, had wanted to run for president of the United States himself, but he couldn't because he had too many skeletons in his closet. So the next thing in line would have been his son, Jack, John F. Kennedy. He knew that John F. Kennedy, like I said earlier, would have problems getting elected. And so what he needed to do was he needed to use, and for the life of me, I don't understand why Joe Kennedy does this, considering he knew all these mob guys to begin with. He had ties to Lucky Luciano and all of these guys. But he ends up making a call to Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra goes out to the compound, and Joe basically explains that he needs the mob's help. He needs them to help Jack win the election. He also needs Frank Sinatra to employ his Hollywood friends and directors, actors, musicians, etc., to back Kennedy. And he would look at it as a great personal favor to him, and that if John F. Kennedy were elected, that the mob would have no problem getting back to business. They would have no problem doing what they wanted to do. And that was sort of the agreement that was made. So Sinatra goes to Sam Giancana because Chicago was a major area, Cicero, Illinois being one of the major hubs of the poll districts. And Frank just kind of levels with them and says, this is what they're saying, that if we can help get this guy elected, he'll lay off and make sure that guys like us are, because Frank Sinatra always considered himself a gangster, that they'll lay off everybody and we can just kind of go back to business as usual. Maybe that'll parlay into some Cuban shit and whatever. So Giancana goes to work. More dead people voted in that election than any other election that's ever existed. If you look at the poll numbers, it was very close. Dead people voted. People got to vote twice. There's some highly suspect shit that took place during that election. So as a result, Kennedy gets elected, and then Bobby Kennedy, for some fucking reason, decides to go all fucking bitch and just starts trying to dismantle the mob. And one of the reasons why was because he was afraid that John F. Kennedy's friendships with, say, Frank Sinatra and Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, and some of these other guys would be detrimental to the Kennedy political dynasty that they were trying to build. So what they immediately do is they shit on Sinatra. They stop talking to him, stop going around him. Sinatra was supplying hookers for John F. Kennedy and for Bobby Kennedy, so it's not like Bobby Kennedy was a squeaky clean guy either. And Bobby Kennedy just starts attacking the mob left and right. Joe Kennedy tried to step in and stop it. John F. Kennedy tried to step in and stop it, but they just couldn't. Bobby was going to do what Bobby was going to do. And so take that and set that to the left. Now, the other thing that's going on is the shit with Jimmy Hoffa. They're going after Jimmy Hoffa as well. Bobby Kennedy starts all his hearings. Ray Patriarca, you name them, they were all pulled. Carlos Marcello, he got fucked with probably more than Hoffa and everybody else, because it was Bobby Kennedy who had Carlos Marcello kidnapped and thrown in the jungles of fucking Guatemala with nothing but the clothes on his back. They literally took him in a plane, kidnapped him, put a fucking parachute on him, threw him out the fucking door at like 10,000 feet, and said, good luck. Carlos Marcello ends up finding his way back to Louisiana. And ever since that day, he swore to God he would kill the whole fucking Kennedy family. And from what I understand, and from things that I've heard over the years, is that ultimately it's not so much that the mob had an issue with John F. Kennedy, because they understood that politics were politics. They really wanted Bobby Kennedy dead. But the thing is like, how do you kill the snake? You chop off its head. And so that's why I've long believed that when the mob reacted, which is what they did, they killed Kennedy they killed John F. Kennedy thinking Bobby would finally shut the fuck up. And when he wouldn't, look what happened to him after that. So that's a conspiracy theory, but you have to understand the politics that are involved in this. Kennedy used them to get him elected, allowed his brother for whatever reason to go fucking crazy, and ultimately the mob would react. And it's long been my belief that that's exactly how it went down. Now, and how does this correspond to Trafficante? Because Trafficante was allegedly in on a lot of this. There is, and I don't want to get into this because it's going to be a huge rabbit trail. But if you look out, oh God, what is it? Zapata Oil, Zapata Oil, George H.W. Bush. It was a company owned by George W. Bush. They were doing some insane, serious fucking shit down in Florida, and they were directly aligned with Johnny Roselli, and through Roselli brought in Trafficante. So Trafficante was involved in some serious shit. Trafficante was also given a lot of deciding power at some of these commission meetings. He was a very important guy. Granted, Florida was always considered open territory, but believe me when I tell you, everybody, that that Trafficante got a kickback from everything. Okay. All right, so in 1978, both Trafficante and Jose Alman were called to testify at the U.S. House Select Committee on the Assassination, investigating the links between Lee Harvey Oswald, anti-Castro Cubans, and the theory that Castro had Kennedy killed. One, the government knew that Castro didn't have Kennedy killed. Castro didn't have that type of fucking power. You got to be kidding me. However, Lee Harvey Oswald's something different. The reason why I tell you is very simple. Jack Ruby ran Midwest saloons and casinos for the mafia, mainly for Chicago guys and for Russell Buffalino and for, oh Christ, why am I having a brain fart now? For Buffalino, for Giancana, and also for some other guys. I don't know why it's like, it's killing me. Why am I having a brain fart? Anyway, but it was Johnny Roselli who introduced Oswald to Jack Ruby. Now, here's the thing. If there's no connection between the mob and Oswald, why does a mobster like Johnny Roselli introduce another guy by the name of Jack Ruby, who was a gangster, into Lee Harvey Oswald? You know, it was Oswald's uncle was also involved in organized crime. A lot of people don't report that. So I'm not trying to play conspiracy theory here, but what I am saying to you is that when it smells like it, looks like it, and tastes like it, it is. Jack Ruby was a gangster. He ran saloons in the Midwest. He directly worked for Marcello in a lot of ways. That's who I was talking about. I forgot to mention earlier. He was directly worked for Carlos Marcello. In fact, it was at a Carlos Marcello-owned club where Oswald was introduced to Jack Ruby through Johnny Roselli. So if you take that all into sort of the big pot of shit that we're talking about here, I find it very hard to believe that the mafia didn't have some involvement. It's also been long rumored that the Zapata oil, which also used agents to train on property owned by Roselli, that Oswald was there training on weapons, as far as rifles and stuff like that. So I could sit here all day and talk JFK conspiracy theories, but for this part of the show, it's just important that you see the connections. And it just goes to prove that Trafficante was a man to be dealt with. He just was something else. In September of 1978, Ailman once again tells his story about Trafficante's statements back in 1976. Trafficante would be given immunity, but he denied the statements of Ailman completely, saying that he never met Oswald or Jack Ruby, which were both notorious lies. And I say notorious lies because he was introduced to Oswald. He was introduced to Jack Ruby at the same meeting Oswald met Ruby through Johnny Roselli. He was there for a reason. He admitted in 1960 and in 1961 that he worked with the CIA to attempt to poison Fidel Castro, and that Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli brought him in. So we have the connection between Roselli to Giancana, Giancana to Ruby, Ruby to Roselli, Ruby to Trafficante, Trafficante to Oswald. So it all connects. It all connects. In 1986, he would be questioned about his involvement with the King's Court Bottle Club. If you don't know what King's Court Bottle Club was, if you've ever seen Donnie Brasco, you know completely what that is now. The King's Court Bottle Club was operated by the Bonanno crime family, which was infiltrated by that scumbag Joe Pistone, a.k.a. Donnie Brasco. Trafficante would be charged and indicted, but he would escape conviction, which probably fucking infuriated Joe Pistone. March 17th of 87, he ends up dying at the age of 72. And so while there's a million things that we can talk about, I think for the sake of this show, and there is a lot more about Trafficante that we could talk about, and I want to definitely do like an insane, more in-depth show about him. But one of the unique things is that he is a guy a lot like Russell Bufalino, who was involved in some of history's biggest scandals and schemes. He was relatively left alone. He was operating down in Florida. And there's something to marvel at that. He ran his family from 54 to 87. That's an incredible amount of time. He owned politicians. He was involved in some of the biggest decisions in the mafia. He pretty much, probably, of all the gangsters that were involved in the Cuban thing, was probably had more property and more real estate and more investments into Cuba than fucking Meyer Lansky did. So I think he'll go down in history. I mean, that would be a great movie, wouldn't it? The Life and Times of Santo Trafficante. Just from drugs to conspiracy theories to the government to, how many of these mob bosses were involved in quite possibly a presidential assassination, narcotics trafficking, the CIA to kill to kill somebody from another country. These things are just not like your average thing. Bufalino was the same way. He was very involved with. Bufalino also owned property down in Florida and had a lot of business with Trafficante. They were very good friends. So I think, when we think of the mafia, this is why I like the glory days so much. Everything in the 80s and 90s is definitely entertaining. That was sort of like the Wild Wild West. But I'm a really big fan of just the history of organized crime in general. And I think, when you move past 1975, it gets a little dicey. It's not the same. But that's sort of the life and times of Santo Trafficante. His father was incredibly wealthy and good, but the son was just absolutely sharp as a tack, was very, very business-oriented, and would not hesitate to kill somebody either. Would not hesitate to kill anybody. And he owned a lot of businesses in Texas with Sam Silver Dollar Corolla. If you've never heard of Sam Silver Dollar Corolla, look that up. But that's pretty much it. We're at like 2 hours and 15 minutes at this point, and it's probably best to kick it in the ass or the balls as we speak. So next week, I may take a week off. I'm not sure yet. Probably likely I won't. We'll do an all-new topic, a big Q&A. I'd like to do a whole entire 2-hour show of a Q&A, so maybe we'll do that actually instead of a topic for next week. In the meantime, check out Brooklyn Ties. Check us out on Facebook, Mob Talk Radio. Check us out on Twitter at Real Mob Talk 7, Mob Talk Radio, of course. Check out Scott William Collier's page on YouTube. Please subscribe to his channel. He's trying to get started. He does good stuff. I enjoy it. That's under True Crime page. Other than that, send all your complaints, your grievances, your threats, whatever it is. You know where to send them. Have a good week, everybody. Try to be good to one another, and we'll see everybody next week. Same time, same channel. Have a great week.